back at the beginning of 2025, we launched this new series, public affairs series, that we are calling At Issue, to discuss some of the very critical issues that we're faced with today. And we've been enormously fortunate to have been able to host extraordinary journalists and experts and scholars in many different subject matters, and tonight is no exception. Couldn't be more honored to welcome Julia Preston and Dara. Julia was at the New York Times reporting about immigration for about 20 years, and then went to the Marshall Project, and is now writing a book about the Dreamer era. And Dara was at ProPublica, Vox, and is now at the American Immigration Council. Both of them have been exploring, writing about, reporting about immigration for years. Couldn't be more thrilled to welcome them both. They're going to talk, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So please welcome Julia, Dara.
So I'll start out. We're just going to have a conversation here. Thank you so much for, again, I reiterate our gratitude that you braved the elements to come out and for this conversation. And
for such a cheery subject.
So I think where we could start maybe the conversation is just trying to figure out what's new about Trump 2.0 and what is a continuity of a kind of enforcement and a dysfunctional immigration system that people have been living with for many years. And the way I think about this is, to me, what is happening now is that President Trump is turning the entire country into a borderland, so that the authorities, the kind of aggressive enforcement, the lack of accountability, the freedom to roam that the Border Patrol and ICE have had at the southwest border for many years, now those authorities, those practices, now they are spreading those out to American cities in a way that allows many more Americans to see and experience what that has been for a long time. And part of that practice, I think, is to, in the borderlands, the authorities basically regard anybody who is there as a suspect and a likely criminal, somebody who crossed the border unlawfully. And now I think that mentality, that view that all of our immigrants are likely to be criminals, is now also pervading the practice and the immigration enforcement that we're seeing today. So that would be my reflection about that. I don't know, how do you see that? What do you see as the continuities here?
So I think that you're right that it's really empowering this border mindset. And I think that even more specifically than that, the institutional culture of U.S. Border Patrol has always been this kind of, you don't know how hard it is where we are, and therefore you can't judge us. It's always been very resistant to external oversight. It's always had some real accountability issues. And those people, Greg Bovino is the most obvious example of somebody who got, taken from a Border Patrol position to running interior enforcement as like the guy who was on the ground most visibly in Chicago, in Minneapolis,
Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's deeper than that. There was a moment last year when the heads of several regional ICE offices were fired, were purged essentially, and the people who were put in to replace them as acting officials were from Customs and Border Protection, which is the agency that includes Border Patrol. And that got seen by many people, I think correctly, as a statement about, ICE, which has existed this point for like a couple of decades and has its own institutional culture and has historically been pretty averse to going into communities when they could be just picking people up from jails, was moving too slowly, and Border Patrol embodied the kind of enforcement that the Trump administration wanted to see everywhere. But the other thing for me is that like the idea that the border is everywhere now is something that I remember hearing when I first moved to DC in the first Obama administration, because it's, I think, the idea of immigration enforcement has always been a little bit entangled with the idea of the border. And like, there's always been a little bit of cognitive dissonance for people now that in the 21st century we've had a large interior enforcement capacity. It's been hard for people to really figure out what that should mean in practice. And it's always seemed a little bit weird that, you know, you could be arrested while living in the United States. It's always that has, when that first became really possible, when, you know, the Obama administration was deporting 250,000 people a year who had been living in the US, the idea that the border is everywhere now was something that people were really seizing on to kind of describe how that era felt. And so I think that there really is something here about like, we never really solved the interior enforcement thing.
Yeah. But also I think it's, I mean, you know, the sort of the backdrop here for me is that, you know, for decades now, have been running an immigration system that allows millions of people into the country and doesn't provide them with lawful status, with a lawful way to be here. So we've created a whole kind of, you know, a workforce that is, you know, outside of the law. And at this point, we have 13.5 million undocumented people in the country. And so for them, this, you know, the idea that the immigration system is not about the border, but is in fact about their day-to-day lives and the sort of control that the immigration system has over their day-to-day lives as an interior police force. This is something that a lot of immigrant families have been living with for decades at this point. And so, you know, to me, that's the backdrop. And you often write about and think about the other aspect of this, which is there are millions more people who are not undocumented, but they have some kind of tentative status, insecure status.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, if anything, the American public has gotten too used to the fact that there are like millions of people who have no legal status who have been here for decades, insofar as like it's not a thing that people should necessarily just be accepting. But you know, the reality of like when Congress was making a big deal about comprehensive immigration reform in like the late 2000s and early 2010s, the phrase you'd hear from supporters is, you know, we need to know who's in the country. Those people need to register with the government. They need to get in line. They need to get on the books. And increasingly, especially over the last 10 or so years, millions of the same people who we think of as undocumented are in regular contact with the government. Some of them are, it's because they're in immigration proceedings, in immigration court, and so eventually they are either going to get legal status or get an order of deportation, but that's happening over the course of years. But for many of them, they've been given these kind of temporary protections because the government in power said, you know what, this is a population that we really don't want to deport. We can't make them citizens, but we can use these other legal tools to give them work permits and to give them temporary deportation protections. So, you know, you have had millions of people when Trump came into office who had temporary protected status. You still have several 100,000 DACA recipients.
800,000. It's a big number, isn't it?
It's reduced both because of like they weren't accepting new applications for a while, and because some people have adjusted out successfully. But like you still have 600,000 who like don't have another answer there. The Biden administration absolutely loved giving people temporary protections. You know, a lot of the programs they created to like let people into the country gave them temporary protection and had absolutely no permanent pathway to permanent legal status. And so what we've had is this moment where like a bunch of short-term decisions that have seemed compassionate in the moment because, well, of course you don't want to deport the Salvadorans who've now been here on TPS for like 20 some odd years. Of course you don't want to deport people back to, Haiti or Sudan. Of course you don't want to deport people, who came here as children and are now in their third, fourth decade even of living in the United States. But like, if you can't give them an alternative that is more than temporary, you're just setting up the dominoes for a future administration to knock over. And that's exactly what we've seen. The Trump administration has stripped millions of people from some form of legal status and has treated them with the same kind of aggression that you would expect them to treat people who had, you would expect of, again, presumed criminals, right? Like people who are showing up at their court hearings or at their ICE check-ins or at their USCIS green card appointments and getting arrested and detained. And that's a reflection both of the kind of tactics that they're using, but also this broader effort to, as far as the Trump administration is concerned, if you aren't, if you don't have like a congressionally authorized category of immigrant visa, then they treat you as just as, undocumented, just as unauthorized, just as criminal as somebody who has been deliberately evading the law for several years.
Yeah. I mean, so that I think brings us, these are some of the things that are in the background, but that brings us, okay, is this new, what we're seeing? And the answer is yes. This is the scale, the scope, the aggression, and I think the underlying purpose, we're not only talking about enforcement, we're really talking about a purge. We're talking about an entire change of view of what immigrants provide to the United States, and the Trump administration in the second term is really taking every tool that is available to it, and some that shouldn't be available or that are not legally available, and looking to remove from the, it's literally mass deportation. He told us repeatedly during his campaign, people waved the signs during the campaign, mass deportation now. And he meant it, and that's what he's doing. We are witnessing a purge of immigrants from the country, and so that is really different from, at least in modern times. I mean, you could go back and talk about Operation Wetback in 1954, but even that didn't have the kind of national scale that what you're seeing now is the undertaking that you're seeing now. So do you agree with that? Or?
The moment that really crystallized this for me wasn't inauguration, and it wasn't like the first day executive orders or any of that. It was Congress passing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, because that gave, like, historically, CBP and ICE have gotten a great deal of money from Congress. And then if they've overrun their budget, they've come back to Congress and said, if you don't give us more money, then we're going to have to release criminals into the United States. And Congress has said, okay, you can have more money. So like budgeting has always been a little bit fake, but this was Congress giving ICE what they requested for a mass deportation operation. And for those of us who had been saying in the days like, in the early days of the Trump administration and during the transition, like, look, the big obstacles to mass deportation aren't that they legally can't do it. It's a state capacity issue. We've just, as much more interior enforcement as we have now, as we had in like 2024 than in 2000, we still didn't have the kind of scope you would need for 1 million deportations a year, or for getting, 11 or 13.5 million people out of the country in a few years. They've like used some legal tools to get rid of some of those bottlenecks, but the biggest bottlenecks have been logistical. Like the first week of the administration, a lot of the people they arrested, they had to release because they just didn't have detention beds for them. And the expansion of detention, their insistence on treating mandatory detention for everybody as a policy, their use of things that were just like spare rooms at USCIS offices that were like, you can hold a person here for 15 minutes and then ICE is going to pick them up and take them to real detention, now becoming places where many people are being held for several days. All of that has allowed them to really ramp up the biggest, like what had been their biggest logistical bottleneck. And so we may not have mass deportation quite yet, but we absolutely have mass detention.
I mean, just to remind everybody, the big bill is $170 billion for immigration enforcement. This is a 5 times increase of the budget of the authorities for immigration enforcement, and especially for immigration detention, which is what Dara is talking about here. And, and this is, the Trump administration has articulated a goal of deporting 1 million people a year. And that goal, those sort of numerical goals are really driving so much of what we're seeing, because there's a detail about that is, I think, important for people to understand, which is, in the past, the deportation figures have included people who were removed from the border or were expelled from the border. It's just, this is just explaining the data. The deportation figures included people who were expelled from the border and people who were, deported by various means from the interior of the country. So now the number of expulsions or returns or deportations from the border has dropped very dramatically, because the one thing that I don't think there's any argument about is that the Trump administration has been incredibly effective at diminishing unlawful entries at the border. We can talk about that, and so now all of those big figures, that million deportations, they have to come from our community, from Minneapolis, from Los Angeles. They have to come from inside the country. And so that's part of, when President Trump talks about a goal of deporting 1 million people, he's talking about getting those people from these communities, from our communities. And so that's part of what's going on that is so different.
I actually do want to drill down on the decrease in border crossings a little, because it's a shoe that I have been expecting to drop, to be honest. I've been expecting those numbers to start, and they've gone back up from where they were in January, but I was expecting this to look a lot more like Trump's first term, where for a few months there were really, really low levels of border crossings. And then eventually people figured out, that for all the rhetoric, that there were still ways to get into the US. And so after the first year, numbers were looking a lot higher, and fairly elevated levels of crossings in 2018 and 2019, which meant that they had to, scale back. A lot of the headlines that you might remember about interior enforcement during the first Trump administration, those are 2017 stories, because they just didn't have, ICE had to use those deportation planes for recent arrivals. They had to use those detention beds for recent arrivals. I think that we don't yet have a great sense of why this time is different. I think it's very easy to say that they've finally hit a point of cruelty, or a point of just saying, no, nobody can get in, because it is the official policy of this administration that if you cross without, if you cross without inspection, that you are not eligible for any form of legal relief. But I think that there may very well be a component of that to it, that if in the past you had people figuring out that they could cross because they heard from somebody who'd gotten in, or they heard from somebody who'd heard from somebody that they'd gotten in, if that word of mouth isn't coming back, then you're not having any real, anything that smugglers can use to recruit people, right? You're not having any positive feedback loops. But I think the other part of it that we need to talk about is that this administration has been willing to use immigration as a strategic goal in its foreign policy and been willing to not only countenance but encourage human rights abuses as a result. Like, the Trump administration, it's not just that they're working with Bukele and El Salvador on CICOT. They're entirely fine with him treating his own citizens as people who can't leave the country. They're perfectly willing to allow for the chain refoulement, as it's called. Like, they'll send people back to Mexico. Mexico will send them back to their home countries. They shouldn't have been sent back to their home countries, right. But the U.S. can say, well, we didn't know Mexico was going to do that. And Mexico can say, well, we didn't know the U.S. had found that they shouldn't be sent back to their home countries. And so, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that sort of thing that, you don't necessarily need to be an enormous human rights dove to see it as a big departure from the role that America has usually played in country to country negotiations. And it's wild that this is happening at the same time that there's so much more military aggression in the hemisphere, that there's also a kind of quiet interest in keeping governments in power that will stop the northward flow of migration so that no one is even crossing into the US at all.
Yeah. So, $170 billion. What are they doing with that? I mean, I think what we've seen is an approach to enforcement where really the show of force is a primary sort of tactical approach, and just all the things that are going on that are really different and much more aggressive in this administration. I mean, you have the legitimization of racial profiling, so that you have, ICE has, and actually the Supreme Court, Justice Kavanaugh, in a ruling that hopefully will live in infamy, has made it legitimate for ICE and CBP to basically arrest somebody detain somebody based on their racial profile, their racial profile, the location where they happen to be. Is this person in a Home Depot parking lot? The sound of their voice. Are they speaking a language, or are they speaking English with an accent? I mean, so we have this, legitimization of racial profiling. We have now the Border Patrol operating in our cities. So it's, this idea that the cities have become a borderlands is actually the case, that the Border Patrol is now operating in Minneapolis. The Border Patrol is leading the operation in Minneapolis. You have roving patrols on the streets, where this is they're going out there. They don't have probable cause. They don't have warrants. They're just roving down the streets and looking for people. You have this incredible escalation of the violence of their tactics, where you're seeing them break people's window. If they come up to you, they demand that you show your papers or get out of your vehicle. If anyone hesitates, we've all seen the videos of this. It's really, really shocking. They just break your window and drag these people out. I mean, all of this. I'll say it again. We've been hearing these stories from McAllen, Texas, from, El Paso. We hear these stories for years, but now, what's happening is they're happening in our cities, among us, in our communities. And so it really is a level of escalation that is really unprecedented. And then we could also talk about courthouses, hospitals, schools. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Actually, I want to drill down on something and ask and turn a question back to you, Julia, because you use the term show of force, and I think that this is a question that I often get, right? Is it real or is it just optics? I think that we've been talking a lot about the distinction between things that used to happen on the border where they were somewhat unseen now being very visible. But it's also the case that this administration is deliberately like creating content and putting it out there and is very conscious of the optics. So like, what do you, how do you kind of address the like, is it optics or is it real question?
Well, I think it's in a certain way, you don't have to make that choice because it's part, I mean, it's part of the a campaign to just drive people out of the country. So it's the same thing, you know, why are they proliferating all these detention centers? You know, we were talking about that before, that Dara and I were just talking about this, that, you know, the detention system as it developed, I mean, not exclusively, but there was a lot of detention facilities at the border that were designed for people who had come across the border. They didn't have travel documents. It was an unlawful crossing. And then, you know, if somebody was applying for asylum or there was a process going on, then you would put people in detention at the border. Now what they're creating is this massive system of detention for people who have been living here for years and years, for families, for children. You know, as a way of pressuring people to, as you mentioned before, to agree to deport themselves, to self-deport, to leave, as they say, voluntarily. It's really not a voluntary decision. But so I think that it's the same thing on the street, which is that you're just creating an atmosphere of fear. And we've seen this every place where they've been operating. And, you know, I come from New Jersey, and we haven't had that kind of, you know, showy occupation. We haven't had 3,000 Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents in the streets of Jersey City, but they are operating all over the state, and particularly up in the northern part of the state where I live. And people are scared. You know, the whole phenomenon that you're seeing, people are not sending their kids to school. They don't want to go to their medical appointments. You know, it affects the entire community. And so, you know, the issue there is, well, at a certain point, if your kids can't go to school and you don't even feel safe going to the grocery store, maybe it's time to think about leaving. Especially if you've been in part of this system where you've been here for 20 years, you know, have 3 kids that have already graduated high school. All of them are U.S. citizens. You've been working, paying your taxes, living in your community, going to your church. You've been a good member of your community, and you still, you know, we still haven't given you any way to, no path to, you know, get right with the law. You know, maybe people are going, okay, I give up, I'll leave.
Yeah, I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think the problem with understanding the role self-deportation plays in the administration strategy is that everything they say about it is wrong. Like, yeah. They talk about self-deportation being important, and that is a correct description of their strategy. But then they talk about it as like, we will help you, we will give you financial assistance. We already have seen so many cases of people who, like, you know, left, like, bought plane tickets home, took the plane home, were reassured they would be reimbursed, and then it was like, oh, actually, we sent you the money order while you were still in detention, while you were waiting for your plane, or like, oops, we don't know what happened, and now you've run out of time to request the reimbursement. They've recently started putting signs up in detention centers about like, we will give you a few $1,000s. And so people will come up, you know, for their immigration hearing and say, look, if I'm going to get a few $1,000s, I will sign that deportation order. And the judge says, I can't make ICE give you that money. You have to have that conversation later. You're signing the deportation order now, and then you can negotiate for the money. I think I would be surprised if ICE was operating in extremely good faith in all of those cases. But like the point of that, the underlying point of that is that people are, especially in detention, are thinking about it as this sucks. This is horrible. This is much worse than it's ever been before. The guards are more abusive than they've ever been before. It's more crowded. That means we have less access to food, less access to healthcare. I can stay here fighting my case for ages, or I can accept a removal order and go home. And a lot of people are taking that latter choice. And we know that there are really aggressive efforts in detention centers to get people to sign orders anyway. But it is, I don't know that we're ever going to get reliable numbers on how many people are self-deporting generally. Like, the administration has thrown out these ridiculous numbers based on absolutely no methodology whatsoever. And it's kind of like, well, how would you know if somebody who, by definition, you're kicking off the books? Like, no one you've stripped TPS from is going to show up and say, hey, I'm still here. Hey, I'm still here, you know? But also, we have a lot of evidence that self-deportation is working within the detention system. And I think the other part of this is like what you're talking about, which we tend to call the chilling effect. The people who haven't yet been caught up in immigration enforcement, who are letting the danger of that run their lives, and who are kind of sequestering themselves from public life as a result. And the question has always been for me, you know, to a certain extent, that is a victory for the administration, right? Like, if you don't have people in your neighborhood who are speaking Spanish anymore, then, you know, I guess that like you feel that your culture is less threatened and more safe. But it is, you know, like, I struggle a little bit with like talking about the intention is to drive immigrants out of public life even more than to deport them. I don't know that intention matters a whole lot, but I think that what we have seen in a lot of cases is a lot of like quiet quitting of public life. And that's something that's going to have real consequences. We're talking about like, you know, parents of children. We know that that's the sort of thing that kids pick up on, and we haven't really thought about, there's a lot of talk during family separation about the trauma that, you know, the long-term trauma that this has on children. There was never as much talk about what it means for children to grow up when they know they're vulnerable. And I think that we really need to think about, in these cases where people aren't self-deporting but are self-sequestering, what that means for their kids, many of whom are, like, as you've been saying, themselves U.S. citizens.
Yeah. Another thing that's happening that, again, you know, we maybe should talk about this a little bit, is the short-circuiting people who are still trying to do the right thing, and, you know, who are following process, who are going to the courthouse, you know, particularly, I think, the arrests of people at the courts. So what was going on in those situations was that people were going to their hearings. In a lot of cases, these are asylum cases. So these are these very long, very complex cases. They take ages. There's this huge backlog in the court system. The Trump administration has been firing experienced immigration judges and replacing some of them with military JAG officers who have no experience in immigration law. So people, you know, so there are these huge problems in the courts, and then people are still trying to pursue their asylum claims. They have an attorney. They go into the courtroom, and because of a peculiarity of our system, the prosecutor is an ICE officer, is a person from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the prosecutor in an immigration court hearing. And so ICE goes into these hearings and asks the judge to dismiss the case. And so the immigrant thinks, oh my God, this is fabulous. You know, they're dismissing my case. And then the case is dismissed, and then this immigrant walks out into the hallway and is arrested by ICE. And they apply an expedited removal procedure, and the next thing that immigrant knows, they're back in El Salvador. They've been deported. Yeah, so this is a real. It's like a frontal attack on due process and on, you know, the trust that people could have in terms of participating in the legal system.
Yeah, I think that the Trump administration's approach to like immigration courts in general has been to find a bunch of one weird trick, you know, things like what you're talking about is the result of them first saying expedited removal, which is an authority that allows people to be deported without a hearing, which the way Congress wrote it was, well, the executive branch gets to determine the parameters of this as long as it isn't used for anyone who's been here over 10 years. And so historically, the executive branch said, we will use expedited removal for people who we have reason to believe have crossed the border within the last 2 weeks, and we will not use it outside the 100-mile zone that constitutes the border in certain legal senses. This administration came into office and said, actually, we're enforcing it to the maximum of the law. We can use expedited removal on anyone we catch anywhere in the country, as long as they can't show us that they've been here for less than 2 years. And so this is, and like, if you actually look at the data of who was getting their cases dismissed in immigration court, it was a lot of people. Those cases had been opened 23 months prior, and they were getting dismissed at the 23-month mark so that they could get put in expedited removal before they weren't eligible anymore. That's the kind of like high-level trickeration that we're seeing a lot of. There's been a lot of movement to pretermit asylum cases, which is to say to deny someone asylum before they've had the chance to like fully present their application and had a full hearing. Sometimes that's because they're deemed legally insufficient, but sometimes it's because, you know, as you may have kind of gathered, the administration has signed all of these third country agreements with countries from like Ecuador to Uganda that say someone who's seeking asylum in the United States can be sent to your country to seek asylum instead. So what they're doing is they've deported like dozens, and in some cases like maybe 100 people to each of those countries so far. But what they're doing is, when somebody has an asylum case in immigration court, the ICE attorney will say, well, I'm sorry, you're gonna you should pretermit this case because we could send this person to Ecuador instead. They could seek asylum there, and so there's no reason for you to approve their asylum application now. And the judge will, in some cases, go along with it. They may not be actually sent to Ecuador on any timeline. They may not be sent there at all, but because in theory they could be sent there, that gives them an excuse to not consider the asylum application. So there's a lot of stuff like this where the courts, which have never been entirely independent, like they're employees of the Department of Justice. Under Trump 1, Jeff Sessions, when he was the Attorney General, would like refer a case to himself and then write the decision so that it could then become precedent. And that's like totally okay. But there's always still been some minimal form of due process that having immigration courts has guaranteed. And that's been, fully eroded?
Pretty much, yeah. And I think the point there is you know, there's a lot of high-level expertise in this administration, and particularly in the White House, a lot of it emanating from Stephen Miller, about all the screws that there are to turn in the system to screw it up or just eliminate, you know, channels for due process. And you know, aside from what looks like a very heavy-handed and sort of broad stroke action on the streets, there is, you know, behind that is a lot of you know, turning of screws in a pretty sophisticated way.
Yeah, I mean, although now that I'm thinking about it, the flip side of that has been that, I don't know about you, but if you'd asked me a year ago, are there going to be thousands upon thousands of habeas cases in federal court and federal judges routinely ruling that people should be released from immigration detention, I'd go, oh, heck no. Federal judges give a lot of discretion to, you know, like give ICE a really wide berth on who they're detaining. Habeas is like known to be a like very desperate Hail Mary ploy, but we have seen the federal judges step up, the federal courts step up where the immigration courts have failed in like at least that regard, where you really, you know, so like what do you...
So explain a little bit what happened there, because I think it's confusing. So you'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the administration decided that to apply mandatory detention in a whole bunch of cases, right? I mean, everyone is going to be detained. There will be no bond for people who are going through process in immigration court. And in hundreds of cases, these immigrants have been bringing habeas cases in federal court, challenging their mandatory detention and saying, we should have a right to bond. We should have a right to make a case here. And the judges have been dozens of rulings, to the point where you've had some federal prosecutor, the federal prosecutor who went into court and said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, this job sucks. In one of the what I think this will certainly live in legend as a concise but rather unorthodox expression by a federal prosecutor. In this poor young woman had been dragooned by the Justice Department to go into a federal court and explain to the judge why dozens of people were still in detention when he had ordered them to be released based on their habeas petitions. And this woman was, she'd been up all night and she just went into court and she said, Your Honor, I'm sorry, we can't get to it. There's not enough personnel. My job sucks. And so anyway, she's not doing that job anymore.
I actually do want to even go into a little more detail on that, because this is Minnesota has been really ground zero on the habeas push. And you've seen an escalation of federal judges being increasingly unwilling to give the government the benefit of the doubt. And it's really worth underlining how much the federal court system is built on usually assuming that the executive branch isn't coming into your courtroom and lying to you, and assuming that they're acting with good intentions. And what has instead been happening is it's not just rulings that this policy is unlawful, but no, you have to release this specific person. And this is, most policymakers think about policy as weighing equities, right? You have various concerns that you need to address. And one of the concerns is usually due process. And that just does not rate for this administration. And you can really see just how little they were thinking about anything like this happening, because they'll get, the order for somebody to be released, and then 2 days later, the lawyer will call and say they haven't been released. And so judges had to start getting more and more granular. It was, well, no, you have to release them within 48 hours. Okay, well, we've released them, but we put them on the street in Texas, and they were picked up in Minnesota, and they have no way of getting home. Okay, you have to release them within 48 hours and give them a way to get home. Well, okay, they were given a way to get home, but they still have the government took all their identity papers. So so they've had to just, the extent to which the federal judges have kind of seen it as their job to bring people along, and the prosecutors are kind of caught in the middle. They're actually, this week, they started holding one of the prosecutors in contempt, which means, he's on the hook for a $500 a day fine. He's not the one who can release anybody, right? He's the one whose job it is to tell ICE, no, seriously, the law is important, but they're the ones who are being caught in the middle. And I think that that's something to watch as this administration continues, is how that what is really turning into a battle between the branches gets resolved.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. You'll win with thousands of cases, you'll absolutely win in plenty of them. But they would have reasonably expected to have won in all of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're saying, unprecedented aggression, but also, this resistance and this reaction from the courts. But the other thing that we're seeing that is really unprecedented as well is the level of resistance from the communities, the organization, the monitoring, the communities stepping up and wrapping their arms around their neighbors. And I think it's interesting to provide a little background, a little social background about why I think that's happening, which is that in the last 10 years, particularly, I think there's been a big demographic change in the undocumented population, which is that these families have now been here for so long that you have many families who are what we call mixed status families. So you have one undocumented person. I think the figure I saw was that there are 14 million either Americans or people who are legal immigrants who live in a family with an undocumented person. And there are 6 million American citizen kids, 5 million American citizen kids out there who have at least one undocumented parent. And those kids are not concentrated in one place or another. These are families who are all over the country. And they are also there are caregivers. They are landscapers. There are construction workers. They are, our hospital workers and our hospital orderlies. They are in a whole series of professions that, as recently as the pandemic, we recognize these folks as being essential workers. And so now when you go out and you start pulling those people out of their homes, or you're going to the school to arrest that father, then you are arresting that father in front of my kids. You're the American citizen, the Americans in those communities are now seeing for themselves, they're experiencing for themselves how aggressive and dysfunctional this immigration system is. So I really think that's, this is why we are seeing what I think is in the game changer, or can be the game changer in this moment, which is the whole country is now seeing how our immigration system works. This is how it works. It's keeping all these people from safety. They're not safe. They don't have status, and so the resistance is great, and it's it's so courageous. And I mean, what the people did in Minneapolis, it's unbelievable, But this is, I like to think of this as being our civil rights moment. This is a civil rights question now. We have these millions of people who are out there who are not in a safe situation because we haven't fixed the immigration system for all these years. They have U.S. citizen kids. They're part of our communities. They're part of our churches. And so in addition to the resistance, we need to also be thinking about the next step, which is how do we get to a situation in terms of our power configuration in Washington where we can actually fix the system. So that's the end of that's.
Can we just let them finish first, and then we can...
I have one more thing to say, and then we're going to questions. I'm sorry, y'all. And I think it's just, I come at this from a slightly different perspective, but I end up in exactly the same place, which is thinking about who exactly is stepping up. Like, you have spent, ages and ages following the Dreamer movement, which was a moment when the immigrant rights community more generally really stepped back and let the affected people themselves take the lead. And we're seeing, I wouldn't say the opposite of that, but we're seeing a very different dynamic play out now, and for very good reason. Because even during the first Trump administration, naturalized citizens, people who had legal status, people who had citizen kids were terrified that they would be next. And that was really stopping, they were also chilled just as unauthorized immigrants were chilled, and making choices that were going to make them less vulnerable to attention. That is all the more justified now when they are stripping legal status from people, when they are routinely detaining US citizens based on how they look. And so the fact that people on the front, that a lot of white native-born US citizens are taking it upon themselves to be on the front lines and making it harder for ICE to do their jobs, makes it that's flack that would otherwise be visited on people for whom the stakes would be higher, people who are more vulnerable. But the other reason it's really important is because the immigration system has been allowed to persist in a way that everyone calls broken and no one is willing to fix, in large part because nobody votes on this, like to a certain degree. There are people who will vote against immigration, but it's not something where, it's not like other policy areas where members of Congress are hearing all the time from voters who are getting caught up in the system. Because by definition, if you're a voter, you're already a US citizen. And so even if you have somebody in your family, you don't have firsthand experience with the system. What I'm hoping for, and like this is me as a policy wonk, but also as someone who's been around for several failed attempts at reform, is that people understand that the reason we're here is because Congress has failed to do things, and that's left a lot of people in a very dangerous situation. And the only way that Congress gets its act together and like actually fixes the problem is if it's hearing from people who are voters that they feel a personal stake in getting the problem fixed.
Yeah.
Do you all want to open it up
Yeah.
for questions now? Okay,
Sure.
Megan. We're taping this, so please wait for me to get the microphone to
I have
you.
a loud voice, but I'm sorry to go back to basics, but you say there are X million people who are undocumented.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What is this documentation? How can you go for 20 years with no documentation?
Because-
you have a driver's license, you have...
No, you don't.
Well, a lot
In
of
some
people do.
states you do.
I'm
It-
just
it- so-
confused
so-
about that.
There have been a series of laws since the last time that we had an immigration reform that brought people into the system. There have been a series of laws that have made it harder and harder for people who did not enter the country lawfully the first time to ever get right with the law. So in our criminal system, if you commit an offense, you have a series of options about how you can fix it. You can serve your sentence, or you might take a plea, or you might, there are a whole series of possibilities. In the immigration system, the way we have it now is for 13 million people, there is no path. I can't say this enough. If you gave people a path, they would take it. But there is no path in the law as it exists now for someone who crossed the border unlawfully to correct that status. Even, and this is something that surprises people, even if you marry a United States citizen, it doesn't automatically mean that you can adjust your status. So this is, and yet those people, those people have been working. People find ways to hire them. They're your nannies. They are they're your contractor. They're your landscaper. They have continued to work here, and we do have, so far at least, birthright citizenship in this country. So now they have U.S. citizen kids and grandkids in many cases. So these are families that are really well settled, but they do not, at the moment, have any way to just say, okay, I committed this offense the first time, but, give me a way to fix the problem.
So there are two levels here. The first level is that there's no kind of general open application for a green card, right? In order to get legal status in the United States, you're usually not the person who's applying for it. You, the immigrant, is not the person who's applying for your legal status. Either it's your US citizen, or in some cases, green card holder relative. And there's this whole complicated system of family preference where if you are the spouse of a US citizen, then on paper, you can be, it's going to be pretty quick. But if you are the adult sibling, it's going to be 20 years or longer. You can have your employer apply for you, either on a non-immigrant or either on a temporary or a permanent basis, or you can be screened as a refugee before coming into the U.S. or apply for asylum. And the reason that we have such an enormous asylum backlog over the last 10 years is because that's the only way you can proactively apply. especially if, like, whether you are coming into the United States and get caught by Border Patrol and say, I'm seeking asylum, or if you are here and within a year you can file an application. So if you don't fit into any of those categories, if you like haven't been persecuted in your home country on the basis of, you know, one of 5 grounds that got articulated by the UN in 1968, then you're out of luck anyway. Additionally, and what Julia was talking about with the U.S. citizen spouse thing is Congress put additional barriers in place for someone who had ever been in the U.S. without status to get legal. So if we call them the 3 and 10 year bars and the permanent bar, that depending on how long you've been here without status, you cannot apply for legal immigration status until 3 or 10 years after you've left the country. So for most people who are living in the U.S. as part of U.S. families, the answer is, yeah, should I go live somewhere else for several years, or should I just stay here and suck it up and not take legal status? So those kind of additional barriers happened at the same time that we had a bigger change in the demographics of the unauthorized population, with like more women coming, more children being born and staying in the U.S. And so that's how we have this very, very durable population now.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say they came because there were jobs and people employed them. So this has been our, for whole sectors of the economy, meatpacking, food processing, farm work, a lot of caregiving, a lot of occupation. I mean, from your own community, I'm sure you know who the folks are who are out there doing the work. Right? We haven't given them a way to come and do that work legally. Yeah.
Let me.
Okay, thank you. I think I understand what you're saying, and it's very simple and it's very logical. The solution is to allow these people to be legal. It would be good for them. It would be good for the economy. I agree with that. But I'm wondering, there seems to be an assumption here that that's all we have to do and that can be done, but isn't the reason that's not done is that many people in Congress and the people they represent actually don't want that. They don't want these people here. I think we do, but passing that legislation, wouldn't that require agreement that they have a right to be here and they should, be naturalized? And
well, I mean, what's happened in our politics is that we elected a president of the United States for 2 terms, who describes those people that we're talking about as criminals and as people who eat dogs. I mean, this is a level of demonization that is really toxic. It's this is the rhetoric and the whole notion. It's really a transformation of the notion of what immigration means to the United States. It's, as I said before, it's not just, law enforcement. We need to enforce the laws. What we're talking about now is almost a cultural project where we are getting people out of the country because, they're criminals. They're bad for the society. And so, since those are, that's the politics that we're dealing with right now. Am I optimistic that what I'm talking about is going to happen soon? No, I'm not. But I do think that we have to, that this resistance that we're seeing in the communities is really new. What we're getting from the second Trump administration is very new in terms of the aggression, and the resistance and the social response is also new. It's changing the political calculus and the political possibility. And so I'm just making the point that let's not stop at resistance. Let's understand that what we need to do is, bring people to safety who are, not criminals and who are working hard and have families and are part of our communities.
I also think it's easy to overstate just how much the American public as a whole is hostile to immigrants. Like, most fundamentally, Americans don't tend to think about immigration unless there's a crisis, and then they're very, very mobilized for like a month. And that's, but what we do see is in issue polling consistently, if you're giving people the option of mass deportation or legalization, they will pick legalization. There was exactly one poll in which mass deportation was more popular than legalization, and that was after the election but before the inauguration. I think when we're talking about the past failure of immigration reform in Congress, frankly, the problem with that has been Congress. That there has there has been a vocal and easily mobilized constituency of people who are willing to jam the phone lines to oppose amnesty, and there haven't been an equally motivated swath of voters jamming the phone lines saying it's essential you pass this, and that at a certain point the Republican primary electorate, or at least the people who are actually showing up to Republican primaries, were willing to vote out a couple of incumbents, and that scared everybody. But fundamentally the problem here is that there are a ton of veto points in Congress, and Congress, as a general rule at this point, isn't particularly interested in passing legislation. So I don't know how we fix immigration without fixing democracy, but it is a democracy problem. It's not an immigration problem.
I had two quick questions. These people that are in encampments being detained, if they've been here for more than 2 years, do they get any kind of due process before they're deported?
I mean, it depends. Part of what we were talking about was the ways in which they've been able to erode that. But in theory, yes, you're entitled to a court hearing where the government has to do two things. It has to show that you can be removed, that you don't have legal status, and it has to show that you don't have eligibility for any form of relief, such as asylum. We haven't, but the problem that we're seeing is not that people who are trying to get those hearings are being denied them and shipped off, although we wouldn't necessarily know. The problem is much more that every single day a detention officer is showing up saying, you can get out of here if you only sign your deportation order, and then you don't have to have, then the case is done. There's nothing to bring before a judge.
And I wanted to ask, can people still file for asylum when they come to the border?
Well, no, I mean, I think in practice the answer to that question is no. Yeah, at the border, it's shut down in terms of the asylum process. Yeah, there should be, and it's a subject of litigation, but I mean, don't get me started on how broken the asylum system is. I mean, the asylum system became a sort of mass deportation, a mass immigration system because we didn't have anything else, and it was never designed to be that. And so that's part of the problem, is that people I think what migrants want and what Americans want is an orderly system where people who have something to contribute to the country in terms of their labor or in terms of their talent or their skills can come into the country in an orderly way. And we just have not provided that, and the only thing that even remotely resembled that over the last few years was the asylum system. And so it has become totally clogged and overburdened, and now the Trump administration is essentially trying to shut the whole thing down. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, just curious about the extent of deportation that African asylees and refugees perhaps are facing. Is it largely the Hispanic groups? In particular, Ethiopia, have they, this being such a big population here in the Washington area, their TSP, I think, has expired? And
yes. Yeah.
That's one particular country I was thinking of, but
yeah.
Generally, Africans are just as vulnerable if they're in the same situation as any of the other people. Is that right? Well,
I mean, one of the details that I think is good to note in terms of what the overall principle is here that the Trump administration is pursuing is that currently our refugee system. So we do have a very, very well organized system for refugees. Now this is separate. It's very confusing. I get it. from the asylum system. These are refugees. These are people who are processed outside the country. They go through the United Nations. They go through another vetting process by the State Department, and they come here. In the last year of the Biden administration, we were set up to accept 125,000 refugees from all over the world. The Trump administration has reduced that number to 7,500, and the only refugees that the administration is currently accepting are white people from South Africa. So I raise that because you're asking us specifically about African immigrants. I mean, I wouldn't say. Would you say that it's worse for people from Africa? I feel like it's.
I think for the first time it's as bad. I actually think that like an underrated phenomenon of the Bush and Obama eras of interior enforcement was just how much it was focused on Hispanics, and particularly Hispanic men. The number of deportations was wildly disproportionate to their actual share of the unauthorized population. And now what we're seeing is a broader attack on, Black and Asian immigrants as well as Latino immigrants, and that's it means that not European immigrants, but everybody else is getting a little bit more of the heat that they didn't get when Latino men were the only target. By the way, just because I double checked, a federal judge has put Ethiopia's TPS designation on hold. So termination on hold. So like if you know people with Ethiopian TPS, as far as today is concerned, they're protected. This is a wild thing that's happening that like has been happening, but is happening a lot more now, where like people day to day, it's dependent on whether a federal judge has said
it's crazy.
The administration can make you illegal or not.
But I mean, so one of the things it's another very confusing thing. TPS. It's it's a temporary status. It is an actual affirmative status. You do get a visa and all of that. Do you get a visa? Did I say that wrong? No. No. I'm sorry. Wrong. But it is it. You get a work permit. Yes. It's a more durable status than some of the other things that exist in the system. And so I think recently they just canceled TPS for Yemen, right? So the idea of TPS is that you're not supposed to be sending people back to a country until it's all peaceful and safe. I don't follow the news from Yemen that closely, but it just doesn't seem to me that it's been peaceful and safe in Yemen.
I mean, these people terminated TPS for Venezuela and then bombed Venezuela.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's it's so reckless. I mean, it's just really. It's so inconsistent with the way that we as Americans think the government should run, and the sort of lawful, procedure that we have. We're supposed to be reaching out to people. It's just chaos that is being created in the system. I'm sorry.
Well, it's kind of frustrating because we have this incredible problem within our country with the people that are here illegally. And yet, beyond immigration, there's the whole migration issue of people just wanting to come north, whether it be here or Europe or elsewhere, away from the heat, basically, and the lack of jobs. For a lot of reasons, there's just this migration phenomenon. And we seem to be at this tipping point of Europe and now us as a country trying to decide, is maintaining our culture more important than somehow really addressing the issue of migration? And I think that's what this administration is basically doing. It's drawing that line. Now, whether people in this country want to get behind that or don't, that's the big question. Because migration is going to be a phenomenon. And I can't envision any system of immigration to be able to handle the volume of people wanting to get here by any means necessary. Okay. And I mean, it's an unfair question, I guess, for you folks, but to me, that's what I see as the problem, is that there is no system that can really address that issue.
Well, so, but you see, one of the things that's interesting about this moment is that, you know, I think for years there's been a pretty strong consensus, I think, out in, you know, in the American public that we want an enforced and orderly border. We don't want people coming, you know, in chaotic fashion across the border, which was what the problem that Joe Biden got into, because he lost control of the southern border. We want, you know, border control, but we also want an orderly system for people to be able to come into the country. And at the moment, we do actually have, you know, for better or worse, I'm not defending it the way they did it, but President Trump has achieved a level of operational control at the border that we have not seen since 1970. So there's an opportunity there, since you know that is under control in a way that I think a lot of Americans do actually support. Then that gives you an opportunity to then reflect and see what you can do to fix these long-term problems that we have, because we have not created an orderly system for people who are in the country to get right with the law, or, you know, for the particular people that we think should be coming in terms of our labor force or our intellectual needs or our innovation or our economy. You know, what's happening right now is actually really not good for the long-term prospects of our economy. And so we do have a need for immigration, and you know, so anyway, I think you're absolutely right about, you know, you know, the kind of two ways of looking at this, or which direction this administration is going. But I don't necessarily think you're right that we cannot aspire to having an orderly system that brings people into the country in a way that is beneficial to our society. I think we can do that, but we have to recognize the failings of the way that we've dealt with this problem in recent decades.
A thing that I think most people don't understand, and that I didn't understand until several years after I'd started reporting on immigration, the majority of global migration, and it's, I wouldn't say overwhelming, but substantial majority of global migration is global south to global south. The biggest refugee camps are all in Africa. The most permanent displacement crises are generally people who are in nearby countries to them. The Venezuelan refugee crisis, like, we were freaking out about a tiny fraction of the millions of displaced Venezuelans, most of whom are elsewhere in South America. So the idea that the level of migration that America and Europe are currently seeing pose some kind of, like, existential threat to our politics is, you know, on the one hand, like, obviously entwined with unstated or stated, like, racialized ideas about who counts as a member of those countries, but also there have been political crises that have been precipitated, like Panama, for example, elected a president a year or two ago on the promise of shutting down the Darien, which is ludicrous, but, like, it's not like there haven't been anti-immigrant turns in politics that aren't in America and Europe. They just don't get the amount of attention. Similarly, there are countries that have done a really good job of embracing their populations. Colombia created, like, a long-term protection for Venezuelans, and Colombia has had the biggest, you know, like, population of them. So I think that if we start understanding that, like, the global north is actually not the people who are bearing the population, the people who are bearing the brunt of receiving, then we can look at other ways that are succeeding and think about US soft power as something that can be used to encourage other countries to be more welcoming, so that people don't have to stay in a refugee camp for 20 years on the hopes that ultimately they'll get selected to come to the United States.
I think we have time for one more question. And
I want to bring it to Washington, D.C., a non-state. I understand for somebody quite high up in the Bowser administration that what has changed, because for years we've had joint federal DC police task forces, at least 6 different areas, and that what has changed is that DOJ at high levels has sent directives to the many different kinds of federal law enforcement present in the district who have law enforcement authority, that they are to look to participate in the immigrant detention process. And so what is very confusing, not confusing, but the word in journalism, as much as I love print journalism, there's a lot of reference to ICE, when in fact a lot of the federal agents out there are very likely not from ICE. And I'm interested whether this phenomenon is also the case in other cities, or because of our jurisdiction, we have a special case.
I think that we've been seeing it a little more consistently than other places, but that's just my perception. When this administration came into office, one of the first things they did was task thousands, tens of thousands of agents from the Department of Justice, including like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, including the FBI, and say, your job is working with ICE now. So yeah, I've tried to say immigration agents or federal agents when I'm talking about the people who are on the ground, and ICE when I'm talking about the agency. But it is, and I think that honestly, this is an underrated part of what Julia was talking about in terms of the aggression, is just like the JAGs who got appointed as immigration judges have never dealt with immigration law before. Like some random DEA agent doesn't know anything about immigration law, and you're saying it's your job to pick up 1,000 people a day, like 3,000 people a day. The only way they're going to do that is by relying on racial profiling. But yeah, DC cops are being forced to work with these feds in a way that you can't get away with in places that have actual representation in Congress. But the feds are still being detailed from a bunch of other places.
Julia, any comment? Well, I know there are lots more questions. I know there are thousands of questions, of course, and comments, but I think we'll just have to wrap it up. But please feel free to ask questions privately. And I just join me in thanking Julia Preston, Dara Lynn.
Thank you for coming.
And thank you all so much for coming.